Oliver Cromwell was already 3 years dead when they came for his corpse. The former Lord Protector of England lay buried in Westminster Abbey, supposedly at peace after ruling with an iron fist that made monarchs look like amateurs. But Charles II had other plans. On January 30th, 1661, exactly 12 years after Cromwell ordered the beheading of the new king's father, something unprecedented was about to unfold. The decomposing body of England's most powerful commoner would be dragged from its tomb, hauled through London's streets, and hanged like a common criminal at Tyburn. His severed head would then spend the next 20 years rotting on a spike outside Westminster Hall, a grotesque reminder that even death couldn't protect you from royal revenge. This wasn't some medieval barbarism from centuries past. This happened in 1661 when London was already becoming a center of enlightenment and commerce. Yet here were supposedly civilized people digging up a man who'd been moldering in his grave for years just to make a point. The sheer pettiness of it defies belief. Charles II didn't just want Cromwell dead, he wanted him retroactively humiliated, his legacy literally dismembered before a cheering crowd. You've probably heard Cromwell called many things: military genius, religious fanatic, king killer, dictator. But the truth about how he clawed his way from minor country gentleman to the most feared man in 3 kingdoms makes those labels seem quaint. This farmer's son didn't just topple a monarchy that had ruled for centuries. He built a military machine so efficient it made seasoned generals wet themselves. By the time he was done, he'd signed a king's death warrant with his own hand, dissolved parliament at sword point, and ruled with powers that would make any absolute monarch jealous. Before Cromwell emerged from obscurity, nobody would have bet a penny on this unremarkable man from the fens becoming anything more than a minor landowner. Born in 1599 to a family of modest means, he spent his first 40 years accomplishing precisely nothing noteworthy. No military training, no political connections worth mentioning, just a struggling farmer who couldn't even keep his own finances straight. Contemporary accounts describe him as prone to melancholy, given to religious visions, and generally considered a bit odd by his neighbors. Then came 1642, and the outbreak of civil war between King Charles I and Parliament. Something awakened in Cromwell that nobody saw coming. Within months, this middle-aged nobody had raised his own cavalry troop and was teaching himself warfare by simply doing it better than everyone else. His secret weapon wasn't strategy or tactics, it was religious conviction so intense it bordered on mania. While other commanders recruited whoever they could pay, Cromwell handpicked men who believed God had personally chosen them to reshape England. The transformation was staggering. By 1644, Cromwell's Ironsides cavalry had become the most feared military unit in England. These weren't medieval knights playing at warfare. They were disciplined killing machines who sang psalms while cutting down royalist forces. At Marston Moor, Cromwell's cavalry smashed Prince Rupert's supposedly invincible horsemen so thoroughly that royalist survivors called it supernatural. One officer later wrote that fighting Cromwell's men felt like wrestling with the devil himself. But military genius alone doesn't explain how a minor gentleman became England's most powerful man. Cromwell possessed something far more dangerous: the absolute certainty that God spoke through him. Not in some abstract theological sense. He genuinely believed the Almighty whispered battle plans in his ear. After each victory, he'd write letters describing how the Lord had manifested himself through the slaughter. This wasn't false piety for public consumption. Private correspondence shows a man utterly convinced he was God's chosen instrument for remaking England. Parliament quickly realized they'd created something they couldn't control. Cromwell didn't just win battles. He inspired fanatical loyalty in men who'd follow him through the gates of hell singing hymns. By 1645, he'd risen to second in command of the newly formed New Model Army, a force unlike anything England had seen. Gone were the amateur gentleman officers and pressed peasants. This was a professional military machine where promotion came from competence, not birthright, and every soldier believed they were doing the Lord's work. The numbers tell the story. Before Cromwell's reforms, parliamentary forces lost more battles than they won. After he took charge, they didn't lose a single major engagement. Royalist commanders who'd spent their lives studying warfare found themselves outmaneuvered by a man who'd never held a sword until his 40s. One captured royalist colonel reportedly said facing Cromwell was like playing chess against someone who could see 3 moves ahead while you were still setting up the board. The execution of King Charles I stands as one of history's most audacious acts of political violence. Not because monarchs hadn't been killed before, they'd been assassinated, overthrown, murdered in their beds, but this was different. This was the state itself, acting through legal mechanisms, deciding that a king could be tried, judged, and executed like any common criminal. The precedent it set sent shockwaves across Europe. If the English could drag their anointed sovereign to the scaffold, what throne was safe? Cromwell didn't start out wanting the king dead. As late as 1647, he was still negotiating with Charles, trying to find some constitutional settlement that would limit royal power while preserving the monarchy. But Charles played everyone for fools, secretly negotiating with the Scots, the Irish, even foreign powers, promising anything to anyone who might restore him to absolute power. When Parliament intercepted letters proving the king was planning to use foreign armies to massacre his own subjects, something snapped in Cromwell. The change in his attitude was dramatic and total. Where once he'd spoken of the king as merely misguided, now Charles became that man of blood who had to answer for the thousands dead in civil wars he'd started. Cromwell began speaking of divine judgment, of God demanding justice for innocent blood spilled. Those close to him noticed a new intensity, a conviction that transcended political calculation. One associate wrote that Cromwell seemed possessed by some terrible purpose. The trial itself was a foregone conclusion, but Charles nearly won the propaganda war. Refusing to recognize the court's authority, he maintained regal dignity while his judges fumbled with procedures nobody had ever attempted before. How do you try a king who claims to answer only to God? Charles played his part perfectly. The martyred monarch facing illegal persecution, public sympathy began shifting his way. That's when Cromwell took direct control. Behind closed doors, Cromwell bullied, threatened, and cajoled. Judges who showed weakness found themselves cornered by the Lord General, subjected to hours-long harangues about divine providence and the necessity of justice. He personally hunted down commissioners trying to avoid signing the death warrant, literally forcing pens into their hands. One commissioner later testified that Cromwell had laughed and smeared ink on his face after making him sign, a bizarre moment of black humor in the midst of regicide. The execution date was set for January 30th, 1649. Charles stepped onto the scaffold outside Whitehall Palace with remarkable composure, giving a brief speech before placing his head on the block. The crowd, instead of cheering as at common executions, let out what witnesses described as a universal groan when the axe fell. That sound haunted Cromwell's enemies, proof, they said, that the people never truly supported killing their king, yet Cromwell showed no remorse. That very evening, he was heard saying the execution was the greatest act of justice ever done under the sun. He signed the death warrant boldly, his signature larger than anyone else's, third on the list after the court president. Unlike some who later claimed coercion or tried to minimize their role, Cromwell owned his regicide completely. He'd crossed a line no Englishman had crossed before, and he seemed energized rather than troubled by it. The aftermath revealed the true price of killing a king. European monarchs cut diplomatic ties. The Pope declared Cromwell and his associates damned. Royalists began referring to January 30th as King Charles the Martyr's Day, but Cromwell pressed on, convinced that Providence had demanded Charles's death as surely as it had granted victory in battle. He'd killed not just a man, but the very idea that kings ruled by divine right. Now he had to build something to replace what he'd destroyed. Power has a strange way of turning men into monsters, but Oliver Cromwell managed to become something far more terrifying, a corpse that would haunt England decades after drawing its last breath. When Cromwell seized control as Lord Protector in 1653, England discovered what happens when religious fervor meets absolute authority. This wasn't your standard dictatorship. Cromwell believed God himself had appointed him to purify the nation, and he approached this divine mission with the enthusiasm of a man who'd already overseen a king's beheading. Christmas became illegal, dancing was banned, theaters were shuttered, even makeup was forbidden. Women caught wearing cosmetics faced public humiliation. Cromwell's major generals patrolled the counties like morality police, shutting down alehouses and fining anyone caught swearing. One man was arrested for saying "upon my life," because it counted as taking an oath outside of court. But Cromwell's iron grip extended far beyond petty moral policing. Ireland still bears the scars of his campaign there. Historical records document how his forces slaughtered entire garrison populations. Priests were hunted down and killed. Civilians who'd sheltered in churches were burned alive. The death toll reached hundreds of thousands through warfare, famine, and forced deportations. Cromwell called it the righteous judgment of God. His own parliament feared him. When they disagreed with his policies, he simply dissolved them. When they tried to limit his power, he marched in with soldiers. By 1657, Parliament actually offered to make him king, the very title he'd helped destroy. The irony was lost on no one, especially when Cromwell held a coronation ceremony in everything but name, complete with purple robes and a golden scepter. Then, on September 3, 1658, the Lord Protector died. Some said it was malaria, others whispered about poison. The date itself seemed cursed. It was the anniversary of his greatest military victories. His body was embalmed using techniques usually reserved for royalty, wrapped in purple velvet, and placed in a lead coffin worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. The funeral procession outdid many royal ceremonies. Cromwell's effigy wore a crown, yes, an actual crown, and carried an orb and scepter. The ceremony cost £60,000, enough to feed a small town for years. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, in the same sacred ground as medieval kings. Former enemies were forced to attend and bow before his corpse. But even in death, Cromwell divided the nation. Secret toasts were raised celebrating his demise. Royalists emerged from hiding, spreading pamphlets calling him the Great Usurper and Hell's Agent. His son Richard inherited the title of Lord Protector, but possessed none of his father's ruthless charisma. Within months, the government crumbled like wet paper. The Commonwealth's collapse came faster than anyone expected. By 1659, the army was fighting itself. Parliament couldn't maintain order, and the economy was hemorrhaging money. General George Monk, once Cromwell's trusted commander, marched his forces south from Scotland. But instead of seizing power himself, Monk did something that would have made Cromwell's corpse spin in its velvet shroud. He opened negotiations with the exiled Charles Stuart. Charles II understood that England was exhausted. 2 decades of civil war, military rule, and Puritan restrictions had drained the nation's spirit. So when Parliament invited him to return, Charles promised something Cromwell never could: forgiveness and normalcy. The Declaration of Breda offered pardons to almost everyone except the regicides, those directly responsible for killing his father. On May 29, 1660, Charles II entered London to scenes of jubilation that would have sickened Cromwell. Church bells rang continuously, wine flowed freely in the streets, and bonfires blazed throughout the night. People burned effigies of Cromwell while toasting the king's health. May 29th became Oak Apple Day, a permanent celebration of monarchy's return. But beneath the festivities, darker currents flowed. Charles II might have preached reconciliation, but his supporters demanded blood. The Act of Indemnity and Oblivion supposedly forgave past crimes, yet it specifically excluded anyone involved in Charles I's trial and execution. The manhunt began immediately. Some regicides fled to Europe or America. Others tried to blend back into society, praying their neighbors wouldn't recognize them. Those caught faced trials that were foregone conclusions. 9 were hanged, drawn, and quartered at Charing Cross, their hearts ripped out while potentially still beating, their bodies hacked into pieces and displayed across London. The executions drew massive crowds, but they weren't enough. Too many guilty parties had already died naturally, escaping earthly justice. John Bradshaw, who'd presided over Charles I's trial, had died in 1659. Henry Ireton, Cromwell's son-in-law and fellow architect of the king's death, had perished in Ireland in 1651. Most maddeningly, Cromwell himself had been dead for nearly 2 years. That's when someone, history doesn't record who first suggested it, proposed an idea so audacious it seemed like madness. If the living regicides could face the executioner's blade, why should the dead escape punishment? Parliament didn't just approve this grotesque plan, they made it law. On December 4, 1660, they officially ordered the bodies of Cromwell, Bradshaw, and Ireton to be exhumed and subjected to the full punishment for high treason. The date chosen for this posthumous execution was deliberate. January 30th, 1661, the 12th anniversary of Charles I's beheading. Westminster Abbey's sacred ground was about to be violated in ways that would have horrified its medieval builders. For over 600 years, kings and saints had rested there undisturbed. Now workmen arrived with shovels and crowbars, ready to reverse history itself. The exhumation began on January 26th, giving them 4 days to prepare the corpses for their final performance. Cromwell's vault was opened first. What they found inside depends on which account you believe. Some witnesses claimed the body was remarkably preserved, the embalming fluids having done their work. Others described a putrid mass barely holding human form. The lead coffin was cracked open with specialized tools. The stench that emerged sent workers reeling backward. Whatever state Cromwell's remains were in, they were wrapped in fresh cerecloth, grave clothes soaked in wax, and loaded onto a cart like common cargo. Bradshaw and Ireton received the same treatment, their eternal rest shattered by political vengeance. Guards surrounded the carts as they rolled through London streets. This wasn't mere transportation, it was a funeral procession in reverse, designed to unmake the honor these men had received in death. Citizens lined the route, some cheering, others watching in stunned silence as democracy's architects were hauled away like criminals. The bodies spent their final nights at the Red Lion Inn in Holborn, under constant guard. Soldiers were stationed to prevent any rescue attempts by remaining Commonwealth sympathizers. They needn't have worried. Most of Cromwell's supporters were either dead, imprisoned, or had conveniently rediscovered their love for monarchy. As dawn broke on January 30th, 1661, 3 corpses that had once ruled England were loaded onto sledges and dragged through the mud toward Tyburn, where common criminals met their end. The journey that had begun in Westminster Abbey's royal vaults would end at the Hanging Tree, where horse thieves and murderers swung in the wind. The morning of January 30th, 1661, started unlike any other execution day in British history. The condemned had already been dead for 3 years. Oliver Cromwell's corpse, wrapped in cerecloth and lead, was dragged from its temporary storage at the Red Lion Inn in Holborn. The executioners hefted the coffin onto a sledge, the same type of wooden frame used to drag living traitors to their deaths. Except this traitor couldn't feel the jolting ride through London's frozen streets anymore. At Tyburn, London's infamous execution ground, crowds gathered in the bitter cold. They came to witness something that defied all logic: the hanging of a man who'd been lord of the realm just 3 years earlier. Now his decomposed body would swing from the same gallows where common thieves met their end. The executioners opened the coffin. What emerged wasn't the stern-faced Lord Protector who'd once made kings tremble. Time and death had transformed England's most powerful man into something unrecognizable. The preserved remains, still wrapped in their burial shroud, were hauled up the ladder. They fitted the noose around what had been Cromwell's neck. Let that sink in. Professional executioners, men who'd ended hundreds of lives, now performed their grim ritual on a corpse. The body dropped. It swung in the January wind from morning until sunset. A full day of public humiliation. But Charles II's revenge wasn't finished.
As darkness fell, they cut down the body. The executioner raised his axe over Cromwell's remains. 1 blow, 2, 3, the head finally separated from the body. After multiple strikes, minor decomposition had made the job messier than usual. They drove a 20-foot spike through the skull and mounted it above Westminster Hall, right where Cromwell had signed Charles I's death warrant 12 years before. The body? They tossed it into a pit beneath the gallows. No burial, no marker, just dumped with the day's executed criminals. For a man who'd been given a funeral grander than most kings, this was the ultimate degradation. His fellow regicides, Bradshaw and Ireton, received the same treatment. 3 corpses, 3 heads on spikes, 3 symbols of what happened to those who killed kings. Think about the mechanics of this spectacle. Someone had to pry open coffins. Someone had to handle bodies in various stages of decay. Someone had to force rotted necks into nooses. Professional executioners, hardened by years of killing, now reduced to puppeteers of the dead. Even for them, this crossed into new territory. They'd killed the guilty and innocent alike, but never before had they been asked to execute ghosts. The crowd watched in fascinated horror. Some cheered. These were the royalists who'd waited 11 years for this moment. Others stood silent, perhaps remembering when Cromwell's word was law. Children were lifted onto shoulders to witness this unprecedented event. Vendors sold ale and meat pies while decomposed bodies swayed overhead. London had seen many execution days, but never one where the condemned had already been buried with full state honors. Samuel Pepys, London's most famous chronicler, pushed through the crowd that day. His diary entry captures the surreal nature of what unfolded. This morning Cromwell, Bradshaw, and Ireton were hanged and buried. He wrote with matter-of-fact precision. Yet between those simple words lay an ocean of complexity. Pepys, ever the keen observer, noted how people reacted, not with the usual execution day revelry, but with something harder to define. The spectacle divided London like a blade. Royalist taverns erupted in celebration. Men who'd hidden for years under Cromwell's rule now drank toasts as his corpse swung above them. "There hangs the traitor," they shouted, raising tankards to the grotesque sight. But in quieter corners, former soldiers of the new model army watched in stony silence. These men had followed Cromwell through blood and fire. Now they saw their general strung up like a common cutthroat. Even hardened Londoners found themselves unnerved. They'd witnessed countless executions, burning of heretics, drawing and quartering of traitors, simple hangings by the dozen. But executing the already dead, this was new territory. Some called it justice. Others whispered it was blasphemy. What kind of king needed revenge on corpses? Women fainted at the sight, not from delicate sensibilities, but from the very real stench. 3 years of decomposition, even with embalming, created an assault on the senses. The January cold helped, but when the wind shifted, even the celebrating royalists covered their noses. Street boys, usually eager for any spectacle, kept their distance. Dogs howled and refused to approach the gallows. Puritan families shuttered their windows and prayed. For them, this wasn't just about Cromwell. It was about their entire world being literally dug up and destroyed. Every swing of those corpses reminded them that their revolution had failed. The kingdom of saints had become a carnival of the macabre. Foreign ambassadors scrambled to send reports home. How to explain to the courts of France and Spain that England was hanging dead bodies? The Venetian ambassador wrote that he'd never witnessed such strange justice. The Spanish envoy noted the barbarous English custom, rich words from a nation that perfected the auto da fe. Yet perhaps most telling were those who simply went about their business. Merchants opened their shops. Washerwomen carried their bundles. Life in London continued around the swinging corpses, as if this were merely another oddity in a city full of them. One fishmonger, interviewed years later, remembered selling good fresh mackerel while Old Noel swung overhead. Pepys returned that evening to see the heads mounted on Westminster Hall. By lamplight, the severed skulls took on an even more ghastly appearance. He noted how quickly the crowd had thinned once darkness fell. Brave talk in daylight became nervous glances at shadows. The celebration was over. Now London had to live with those heads watching over them.
Children would grow up with those skulls as landmarks. Turn left at Cromwell's head became actual directions. For 24 years, through plague, fire, and political upheaval, those heads remained. Each storm that rattled them, each bird that perched on them, each gradual wearing away by weather, became part of London's daily reality. Charles II understood something his father never had. Power wasn't just about armies and laws. Power was about symbols, about showing heaven and earth who ruled now. Every person who walked past Westminster Hall received the message written in bone and decomposition. Cross the crown, and not even death will protect you. This wasn't medieval thinking transplanted to the modern age. This was calculated political theater, using corpses as props. The Restoration government needed to erase the Commonwealth completely. What better way than to literally dig up its architect and hang him? You can't debate ideas with a dead man, but you can make his corpse dance on a rope. The posthumous execution served multiple purposes. For royalists, it was cathartic revenge, the tyrant finally meeting a traitor's end. For republicans, it was a warning written in rotting flesh. For foreign powers, it demonstrated the crown's absolute authority. Even death offered no sanctuary from royal justice. But perhaps most importantly, it attempted to rewrite history itself. By executing Cromwell's corpse, Charles II tried to retroactively delegitimize everything the Lord Protector had done. Every law passed, every treaty signed,
every reform enacted, all null and void because they came from a traitor's hand. The physical destruction of the body symbolized the intended destruction of the legacy. Consider the psychology at work. A living person can be executed once, their suffering ends with death. But a corpse, you can execute it again and again in people's minds. Every person who saw those heads recalled the execution. Every mention in conversation revived the humiliation. Charles II had found a way to make Cromwell die repeatedly in public memory. The logistics alone speak to the determination behind this spectacle. Exhuming bodies required legal procedures, even for kings. Guards had to be posted to prevent rescue attempts by Commonwealth sympathizers. The execution itself needed to follow protocol, proper announcements, official witnesses, documented procedures. They treated it as seriously as if Cromwell could feel the rope. Royal propaganda machines went into overdrive. Pamphlets described the execution in lurid detail. Broadsheets carried woodcut illustrations for those who couldn't read. Ballads were composed about the traitor's just deserts. The message hammered home repeatedly, this is what happens to kingslayers, even after death. Yet in trying to destroy Cromwell's legacy through his body, Charles II revealed his own weakness. Strong kings don't need to hang corpses. Secure reigns don't require posthumous revenge. The very extremity of the act betrayed the Restoration's underlying insecurity. If Cromwell was truly defeated, why did his corpse still merit such attention? The severed heads became London's most famous landmarks for all the wrong reasons. Tourists came specifically. The stories you've heard about Cromwell's preserved corpse are complete nonsense. Royal propagandists wanted you to believe his body remained perfectly intact 3 years after burial, flesh still clinging to bone, face recognizable, ready for their theatrical revenge. Palace records from 1661 tell a different story entirely. When gravediggers broke through the vault beneath Westminster Abbey, they found exactly what you'd expect from a body buried without proper embalming in England's damp climate. Bones, some connective tissue, maybe patches of leathery skin. The smell alone sent workers reeling backwards. Those tales about Cromwell's corpse sitting upright in its coffin, pure fantasy spread by royalist pamphlets desperate to make their posthumous trial seem more legitimate. Contemporary witness Thomas Ruggie wrote that identifying the remains required checking burial records and coffin plaques. Nobody recognized faces, because there weren't any faces left to recognize. The bodies had decomposed exactly as nature intended.
Yet somehow the myth of the preserved protector persists. Victorian historians embellished accounts with details about intact features and recognizable clothing. They described scenes that belonged in Gothic novels rather than historical records. One particularly ridiculous claim suggested Cromwell's body had been secretly replaced with another corpse before burial, allowing the real Cromwell to escape abroad. Palace guards supposedly discovered the switch only during exhumation. Complete fabrication, but it sold newspapers in 1850. The severed head sparked even wilder stories. For 24 years it rotted on a spike outside Westminster Hall. Yet legends claim it remained eerily lifelike. Witnesses supposedly saw the eyes open during thunderstorms. The skull allegedly turned to face different directions on windless nights. One account from 1684 insisted the head spoke Latin curses against passing royalists. Weather and decay had reduced it to a weathered skull with strips of dried flesh, horrifying enough without supernatural embellishment. What happened after the head fell during a storm in 1685 generated centuries of false trails. Every few decades, someone claimed to possess the authentic skull. A museum in Suffolk, a private collector in Kent, an Oxford college. Most turned out to be medical specimens or execution victims from Tyburn gallows. The verified skull that eventually surfaced in the 1960s bore evidence of the spike wound and embalming techniques consistent with 1658 burial practices. Even then, some historians disputed its authenticity. The myth served political purposes on both sides. Royalists needed Cromwell's body intact enough to properly punish. Republicans required stories of miraculous preservation to suggest divine protection. Neither camp cared much about biological reality. Decomposition doesn't follow political ideologies. 3 years underground in a lead-lined coffin might slow decay, but it doesn't stop it. The corpses dragged to Tyburn were bones held together by burial shrouds,
not the preserved vessels of revenge that propaganda described. These exaggerations matter because they obscure the real horror. Digging up decomposed remains, stringing them up like puppets, hacking skulls from spinal columns, the actual events were grotesque enough. Adding supernatural elements diminishes the very human cruelty of Charles II's revenge. When we separate fact from fiction, we're left with something far more disturbing than any ghost story. 350 years later, Oliver Cromwell remains Britain's most divisive historical figure. Schoolchildren learn sanitized versions where he's either the father of parliamentary democracy or history's greatest villain. The truth sits somewhere far messier. Modern Cambridge treats him as a local hero. Statues, street names, museum exhibitions celebrating the farmer who became Lord Protector. Travel 60 miles to Oxford, and you'll find memorial plaques honoring royalist martyrs he personally ordered executed. This split runs deeper than geography. Military historians praise his new model army innovations that revolutionized warfare. Constitutional scholars credit him with establishing principles that led to modern democracy. Religious freedom advocates point to his protection of Jews and Protestant dissidents. Each group claims their piece of Cromwell while ignoring the blood-soaked rest, because discussing that blood still makes people uncomfortable. The Ireland campaign where his soldiers slaughtered civilian populations at Drogheda and Wexford. Contemporary accounts describe women and children burned alive in church sanctuaries, priests beaten to death with their own crosses. His own letters called it righteous judgment of God upon barbarous wretches. Modern Irish memorials don't forget. Neither do their history textbooks. Within England itself, Cromwell's legacy fractures along old fault lines. Aristocratic families whose ancestors lost estates under his rule pass down three-century grudges. Working-class movements invoke his challenges to hereditary privilege. Politicians across the spectrum cherry-pick quotes to support whatever they're selling this week. Tony Benn called him a revolutionary hero. Margaret Thatcher praised his strong leadership. Both ignored the parts that didn't fit their narrative.
Universities still fight over how to teach the Commonwealth period. Some frame it as England's first experiment with republican government, a noble if flawed attempt at building something better than monarchy. Others emphasize the military dictatorship aspects, the major generals ruling counties, the crushing of dissent, the surveillance state that monitored citizens' private morality. Students get whichever version their professor prefers. The posthumous execution itself became a historical Rorschach test. Royalists see justified revenge for regicide. Republicans view it as barbaric desecration, proving monarchy's essential cruelty. Moderates call it unfortunate excess during turbulent times. Nobody agrees because agreement would require confronting uncomfortable truths about power, violence, and the stories nations tell themselves. What Cromwell's legacy really teaches us concerns the impossibility of simple historical judgments. The same man who signed Charles I's death warrant also established religious tolerances that wouldn't fully emerge for another century. The military dictator who crushed Parliament when it opposed him also refused the crown when supporters offered to make him king. The Puritan who banned Christmas celebrations protected Jewish worship when most of Europe still burned synagogues. Even his corpse's strange journey reflects this complexity. A body grand enough for Westminster Abbey, then vile enough for Tyburn gallows. A head displayed as traitor's warning, then hidden as precious relic. Finally given Christian burial at Sydney Sussex College in 1960, 300 years late, in a ceremony attended by both Republicans and monarchists who agreed on nothing except the need to end the macabre spectacle. The location remains secret, preventing either desecration or veneration. Perhaps that unmarked grave serves as the most honest monument, neither hero nor villain, just bones that once carried all of history's contradictions.